And good morning in the UK. It's also good morning on this side of the world. It's evening in Australia, evening in New Zealand. This morning we're speaking to Ramin Lakani, who's a partner in a consulting firm in the energy sector with more than 35 years experience in the upstream, midstream and downstream projects. He's currently based in London and has previously worked for ExxonMobil, Premier Oil, BG Group, Shell, Schlumberger, PetroCanada, Baker Hughes, Halliburton, and HARPS Marine. Ramin has worked closely with national oil companies and financial institutions to analyze supply, demand of crude oil and petroleum products globally. A chartered chemical engineer himself, he holds a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Chemical Engineering from University College London and a Master's in Petroleum Engineering from Imperial College London and an Executive Leadership degree from Texas A&M Mays Business School. So we are in good hands this morning and evening in Australia to talk about the energy crisis, the oil crisis, the fuel crisis all around the world with a real expert. So good morning, Ramin.
Good morning to you and good evening, I should say, maybe.
Yes.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, fabulous to have you on. So everyone spoke about the oil crisis at the beginning, but now it's getting really, really intense. Places like Vietnam are sort of borrowing fuel from next door. Australia's saying they'll be rationing oil and petrol in the next 4 weeks. The government's promising them that they'll have enough petrol for until mid-April. Obviously, other countries are reeling from high petrol prices. So, what are the implications of the Iran war now on the global energy sector scene? And I guess let's begin with a focus on short to medium term.
Yeah, sure. And I think sort of I would start by saying that this crisis, of course, the epicenter is in the Middle East, but now it's becoming very clear that it has global repercussions, right? And in my lifetime, I know that there have been many instances of, what if the Strait of Hormuz closes, or what if Iran or someone else closes the Strait of Hormuz? It has never actually happened to this extent, right? For this long, in this way, and I think this choke point has shown that look, what happens in the Middle East really has global implications, and of course, then sort of in the short term. If you allow me to answer your question, I like to really sort of look at it, slice and dice it both from a geographical impact and implications, and also from a sort of commodity or product, if I may. So, of course, sort of on the sort of the commodity, or in terms of supply and demand. I mean, it's no secret now that like 20% of global supply of oil, travels through the Strait of Hormuz, and also something around, something around 80% of that oil was heading to Asia. So, geographically, I'll come to that. Sort of that has obviously significant impact. I mean, you said yourself, Vietnam and many other sort of consumers. But in terms of other products, so it's not just oil. Of course, LNG. I mean, let's not forget that liquefied natural gas, which is now very popular, not only in Europe but also now in Asia. 20% of global supply from Qatar and UAE is completely shut in, right? I mean, I don't think anyone would dare, sail LNG tanker through the Strait of Hormuz anytime soon, right? So then, you've got major impact, right? I mean, again, sort of slice and dicing it geographically, then India, China, South Korea, Japan, these are huge LNG importers from the Persian Gulf region. But then there are other commodities we shouldn't forget about. Aluminium, for example, Bahrain was a huge aluminium uh, producer. Urea, which is obviously used in fertilizers, ethylene, which is a building block in petrochemicals, even something as simple, Mo, as sulfur, elemental sulfur. I mean, Iran, all the Persian Gulf region, especially Saudi Arabia, were major exporters of sulfur, which is a byproduct of oil and gas production and refining, and that has obviously implications for as wide as fertilizers and even EV, electrical, batteries for electrical vehicles, right? So these are some of the implications you need to think about, and also not only the supply in terms of, well, look, I can't get petrol in my tank, but also in terms of prices and the impact that it would have on budgets. I mean, you said quite rightly, Vietnam borrowing. I mean, oil has gone from $60 to $120. These are market crudes, but some other, Middle Eastern crudes have even gone higher. LNG spot price from $300-400 a ton has gone to $1,200 to $1,300 a ton, and this is FOB, like supplied on the Gulf Coast of US, and then you have to obviously allow for transportation costs. LPG, liquid petroleum gas, which is a main source of restaurants and shops and many households in sort of India and rural areas in Asia, is gone up by 30-40%. Even coal prices, the Middle East is not an exporter of coal, but of course, these all have knock-on effects. So while LNG and gas and oil prices have gone up, so some people are now saying, well, let me turn on my coal power stations, which were either slowed down or were not firing up because of environmental or restrictions on carbon. That's gone out of the window, right? So here, what I'm trying to paint a picture that, although there's a lot of emphasis on oil and oil price, there are many other commodities that are sort of building blocks or important around the globe. And I haven't even gone into petroleum products like jet fuel, diesel, gasoline that was exported from Persian Gulf producers around the world, right? So what I'm trying to paint a picture that, look, there are many things that are, if you like, kicked out of orbit, not just oil, first of all. Now, in terms of, you said about short-term impact, I like to also talk about countries and regions, right? Because like any conflict, there are winners and losers, right? Obviously, the biggest loser by far is Iran, right? It's obviously not only physically it's being pounded and beaten, etc., but of course it's losing business a big way. A lot of businesses are down. In the past couple of weeks was the Persian New Year, or Nowruz, which is celebrated in Central Asia, sort of in Iran and many countries in that region. And that is normally a high season for internal tourism, people coming back home, visiting, diaspora coming, Iranians going abroad. That's all has stopped. So that's a big hit on the economy, but also on the oil export. I mean, Iran, before this conflict started, was exporting between 1.5 to 2 million barrels. I think in February, they must have known something is wrong because they, according to my information, they exported on average about 2 million barrels of oil. And that's probably why they've got a lot of oil in floaters around, sort of Asia. And most of that oil was obviously going to China. And then, so that is, of course, a big hit for Iran. Now, other losers naturally are the sort of other Persian Gulf Arab states: Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq. They are all losing, including Saudi Arabia, maybe to a lower extent because it has access to the Red Sea. But these countries, not only they've been, of course, affected by the conflict directly by sort of drones and missiles, etc., but also they've lost, Qatar and Kuwait, effectively, they've lost pretty much all their revenue, right? I mean, in terms of hard currency, they rely almost entirely on, oil and gas, right? Now, other countries that, of course, are, if you like, in the short term have been badly impacted. You mentioned some of them, Asian countries. As I said, they were the recipient of a relatively cheap, plentiful supply of energy and other commodities that I've mentioned. They are big losers, right? Because unlike sort of Europe, US, they don't have alternative supplies, or alternative supplies are quite expensive, or they have to develop new rapport and supply chain through them. I think personally, I believe that sort of China is a big, I would say, loser in this, although China is trying to be very strategic, but losing supply of discounted crude oil and products, petrochemical products from Iran, that's a big hit on the economy. But also with the latest move by the US to allowing Russia to sell its commodities without sanctions, US sanctions, that means that now Russia has a choice. So why would it sell at huge discount of a 10 or 12 or $15 a barrel to China when it can sell to others at a premium, right? And we know they have. Now, on the sort of winner side, of course, big exporters of crude oil, OPEC and non-OPEC, but let's say OPEC, Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, Venezuela, now that it can export its crude oil with sort of, with open arms to US, right? These are sort of big winners, naturally, and they're going to have a bumper year. Or countries like Nigeria and Angola who have big LNG positions. So now their LNG is very much in demand. In terms of sort of the commodity and the sort of the positive impact, and I think the biggest winner is probably US, because it's the biggest producer of oil, it's the biggest producer of gas, it's the biggest exporter of LNG. And those producers and some of the refineries that can now replace the lost products, say jet fuel and diesel, those will be big winners. Of course, US is a complex economy, and the average person who's worried about the sort of price of petrol in their tank, they don't see it that way. But I'm talking about the corporate and sort of global view. US probably will gain. Definitely the oil and gas producers will gain quite a bit.
Very interesting. So it sounds negative at times, but could be positive for some of the big players. So what do you think the attack on the regional energy infrastructure, do you think it's going to escalate, or it's going to stop soon, or it's going to be under control? What's your prediction, Ramin?
I mean, really, it's difficult to predict. Mo, I think going back to my Shell days, we have to rely on building scenarios, because I don't think there's a single linear um, uh, potential outcome. I think there are many scenarios, but my general feeling is that unfortunately, I see an escalation. And I see a situation where, suddenly you will see not only oil and gas, but potentially desalination, potentially power generation, potentially dams in Iran, um, like that. If they come into sort of play, then we're talking about, significant impact. Of course, so my heart, first of all, goes to so people in Iran, but of course to all the people who live in the sort of in the Middle East region. But let's not forget that I've seen some articles. Oh yeah, like who started it, this and that, and who initiated. I mean, it's very clear that IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, so the regime in Iran clearly started hitting oil and gas infrastructures at the very early stages of this conflict. I mean, Bahrain, their aluminium, and then their Babco refinery was hit around the 9th of March, and then there was a fuel depot near airport, which hit around 12th of March. And then actually, I believe there was a desalination plant that was also affected in Bahrain at the early stage. And then you look at Saudi, Ras Tanura refinery, which is on the East Coast, around the 2nd of March, and then 4th of March. That's a big refinery, 550,000 barrels per day, probably the biggest in Saudi. And then Samref refinery, which is on the West Coast, on the Red Sea, and that's a long way to hit. And that's an Exxon joint venture, and that was hit around I think 19th of March. So that's a big impact. And then UAE Ruwais refinery, which is 900,000 barrels per day in Abu Dhabi, was hit. Sort of Qatar. Wow, I mean, Qatar, the news is pretty bad, and we all thought, hey, look, Qatar, before this conflict started, Qatar is friendly with Iran, so it's going to be saved. But no, Ras Laffan, 18th of March, was hit. LNG liquefaction has been affected. From what I understand, the Pearl project, which is owned by Shell, has also been hit. Oman, probably less so. Some of its ports have been hit, but not real the rest of the infrastructure. Kuwait, I don't think the infrastructure has been hit, but of course it's been hit sort of military, I think US military. So I don't, and Iraq, let's not forget Iraq. I mean, Iraq has very strong ties with the Islamic regime, but I know the Kurdistan region has been hit quite significant. So just to sort of summarize, this sort of, the war on...
Can I just interfere for a second? So just for the Western audience, especially Australia, Canada, UK, we need to make it clear. So by Iran or the Islamic State attacking all of these, GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, so does that prove that these countries are allies with America? So they're allies with the West? Because the Western media sort of, conflates. It's the Middle East. The Middle East is the bad guy, and it doesn't make it clear that there are allies with the Middle East, and most of the Middle East are allies with the United States, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, most of the GCC. Um, and that really irritates me because it's just the Middle East is on fire, and people just think the Middle East is the enemy of the West. And I think it's important to point out that Iran or the Islamic State is attacking these countries or nation states because they are allies with the West, which means they're friendly with the West. So I think that's important to state.
Yeah. So I'll come to that more. That's an important point, right? But before I go on that, because now you're talking about sort of regional politics. But of course, regional politics in the Middle East are not delinked from energy, I agree with you. So let me come to that. But before finishing that, is that let's not forget that, of course, Iran's energy infrastructure has been hit as well. Asaluye, which is a center of Iran's gas production, that's like 70% of Iran's gas comes from Asaluye. Now, from what I hear is that offshore platforms of South Pars, which is sort of extension of the Qatar's North Dome, have also been hit. Now, this is the first time that I hear that, look, offshore infrastructure, energy infrastructure have been hit. Now, that's a next level. I mean, you said, what's the escalation? That's the next level, because Iran has oil and gas platforms offshore in the Persian Gulf. So does Saudi, so does UAE, so does Oman, so does Qatar. So that's the next level of escalation, and the environmental impact would be huge and very costly. So I just want your audience to understand that, look, that's the level. If they start hitting offshore energy infrastructure, then we're talking about a much bigger problem, because then, containing a fire onshore, oil depot that was hit near Tehran, of course, it's got environmental impact. It's made the air nasty, etc. But it's onshore. You can somehow contain it and tackle it. But how many sort of offshore platforms can be sort of controlled and brought under control? So that's that. Now, coming to your point about sort of Middle East, and look, it's complex. Yeah. So I would put it this way, that all the Arab nations in the Persian Gulf, right? They didn't want this escalation, and they didn't want this conflict. And if you remember, pretty much all of them, and obviously led by Qatar and Omani foreign minister was hosting the negotiations between US and Iran, if you remember. Yeah. So all the Arab nations, they knew that, look, this conflict is not good, because they've built, basically, especially like somewhere like Dubai or Bahrain, hey, listen, it's a safe area. Even Saudi was saying, look, it's a safe area for tourism. Come from the UK and live in Dubai. It's safe, it's tax-free, etc., etc. They were building this sort of model that they just knew that any conflict, even one rocket, one drone, can shatter, right? Now, so of course, they had good relationship with the US and UK and etc. They had US bases, especially in Bahrain, in Oman, in Kuwait, in UAE, in Qatar. But those those bases, of course, from Iran's point of view, are seen as fair target. So I agree fully with you. The Gulf, the Persian Gulf states, the Arab states, never wanted this conflict. They always had good relations with the West, and they tried to keep a cordial relationship with Iran as much as possible. Sort of a balancing act. Now, going forward, of course, that sort of balancing act, those dynamics, those relationships, will they continue before conflict the way they were before the conflict? I doubt it.
Okay, and that brings us to a very important point we were talking before the show. So the IMEC, so the Indian Media Economic Corridor, would that be affected by, say, the scenario that the Strait of Hormuz could reopen while the war continues, or what's going to happen there with the Strait of Hormuz? Would it reopen? The threat, I guess, by Trump, the 48-hour threat, it's not long now. I think it's like Tuesday morning before he's going to go off and bomb a lot of the gas and the energy sectors inside of Iran. So how does the IMEC Project 2030 vision, how will that be affected? How is the Strait concerned with the major IMEC project? And could the strait reopen while this war continues? Big question.
Yeah, no, of course, and IMEC is an important concept and a project, and I know in many ways it makes sense, right? But it was basically developed to bypass Islamic Republic. Simple, right? Um, because also, and as it happens, it bypasses Turkey, which is obviously another sort of big heavyweight in the region, right? So both Iran and Turkey would be bypassed.
Does that
Islamic
mean
Republic.
excluded? You mean bypassed and excluded from
Well, I mean, IMEC, the way I understand it was that it was basically linking India and the export from India via the Strait of Hormuz, landing in Iraq. I think it was either going through Turkey to Europe, or I think the preferred way was through to Israel to the Red Sea, correct?
Okay, yes.
Okay. So for me, if IMEC, the way I understand it, goes to the towards the Red Sea or the Mediterranean, I should say, then the main purpose is to bypass the access of sort of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah, etc. Right? I think IMEC is a more long-term project. It's probably being rethought or reconsidered. It relies on Strait of Hormuz being opened up. Right now, the long term, I think everyone knows in the long term, this conflict and Strait of Hormuz will be open. But the problem is the choke point and the way I described the number of commodities and the price increase is the concern is the short term. So if I was putting my pension as a bet, I wouldn't say the Strait of Hormuz will be conflicted still in a year's time. I mean, that would be unthinkable. So the problem is more short term. IMEC, so in my opinion, is more of a long term project. Now, you also have to think about if you are, I mean, whoever is the sort of the brains behind IMEC, if we consider a scenario where the Islamic Republic or the regime is changed, why bypass Iran? Because logistically it makes more sense to go India to a big port in Iran, travel through Iran, Turkey, and then to Europe as an alternative.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so what about, I guess, Trump's threat that he's going to, bomb the rest of the energy sector because he wants this war to end? And then we talked about short-term implications. Let's talk about long-term now. Trump wants it to end soon, but what are the long-term implications of closing the Strait of Hormuz?
I mean, the long-term implications for closing of Strait of Hormuz is a disaster globally, as I tried to explain, because it's not just oil; it's LNG, it's LPG, it's products, it's sulfur, it's aluminium, urea, lots of things, right? And it will be disastrous, of course, for countries like Kuwait and Qatar. I mean, they've got lots of money in the bank, but right, you can burn through that fairly quickly, right? But even countries like Iraq, I mean, Iraq, was exporting probably 90% of its crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz, right? So the long-term implications, I just don't want to even think about it because the sort of the global economy, I don't think can handle it, to be frank. Now, in the short term, I think you're right. Trump has threatened Iran with hitting its sort of power infrastructure, etc. I mean, remember that you don't necessarily need to blow up a power generation to stop the sort of the power grid in Iran. The power grid in Iran is quite sophisticated. It sort of consists of many rings, southern, northern, etc., because it's a big country. But certainly you don't even need to hit a sort of power station. You can hit the sort of grid, the network, like they did in Iraq before, sort of they hit Saddam Hussein. But the alternative is that they've asked IRGC, which is in charge really in Iran right now, the Revolutionary Guards, to open the Strait of Hormuz. Now, would the IRGC agree to that? I mean, that's a sort of a big question mark, right? I mean, why would they agree to that? Because effectively, that's the only choke point they've got. And their strategy, the way I see it, is that, hey, we're going to put maximum pressure on the Arab states surrounding the Persian Gulf. We're going to put maximum pressure on the global economy, on the consumers in Europe, consumers in the US, for them to put pressure on the sort of political system.
Yes.
So that, I really can't see how that can really come to a sort of a friendly agreement, unfortunately.
Yes, very interesting topic. I just have maybe one more connected to the last question. So how are they controlling it? So the Islamic Republic, how are they controlling the strait? Like you're saying they're obviously not going to agree to open it in the long term, in the short term. How come they can't be overpowered? And how are they controlling this strait so consistently and so confidently?
Yeah, I mean, look, unfortunately, we don't have a map of the Strait of Hormuz, but basically, it's a sort of a narrow strait that is, it's flanked by territorial waters of Iran and Oman. So there are two countries that are effectively on sort of the northern side, Iran, southern side, Oman, right? And the shipping lanes are very sort of strictly sort of managed, right? In terms of almost like if you think of a highway, right, where ships travel, going from east to west, generally on the sort of the part of the southern part of the strait, which crosses some of Oman's territorial water, and then ships going from west to east, i.e. supplying out, go mostly through Iranian waters. The problem is that the strait is quite narrow. It's about 50 kilometers, and something around maybe I think both Iran and Oman have, I think, 20 kilometers territorial water or something like that. So what is considered sort of international water is very, very thin slice. Yeah. So generally, when ships pass, they pass under normal circumstances, they would pass through part of Omani territorial water, some part of Iranian territorial water, and through what we call international open seas, right? Now, what's happening is that the Iranians have threatened with mines, drones. They have actually attacked ships, so it's not just an empty threat. I mean, there have been ships that have been attacked. The main problem, Mo, is that insurance companies they're reluctant to insure, and it's not just the hull. It's not just the insuring the metal, if you like, the ship, because that can be insured, and even if it goes up by 20, 30 double, you're talking about the price of that vessel. What you cannot insure easily are the content. 2 million barrels of VLCC going through. I mean, 2 million barrels times $120, say $100. You do the maths, right? And then what about environmental cleanup insurance, right?
Yeah.
So that is where ships, or if you have say LNG ship going through and it gets hit, I mean, you're talking about size of a small nuclear bomb going off, right? So, and then if a couple of ships get hit, and then Hormuz Strait is blocked because two ships have sunk in a fairly narrow, relatively shallow. We're talking about maybe maximum, maybe 90 meters depth, 100 meters depth, maybe less. So it's quite tricky. It's not straightforward. So even a small gunboat
Very tricky. Yeah.
uh, slipping through can pose a big threat.
Well, it's been a very, very interesting chat with our expert, Ramin Lakani, partner of consulting firm in the energy sector, former expert ExxonMobil, Premier Oil, BG Group, Shell, Schlumberger, PetroCanada, the whole lot, Baker Hughes, Halliburton, and Harps Marine. So we've been in good hands this evening in Australia and morning in UK and the Middle East. We'll have to get you back on soon and see some new updates, Ramin. Thank you so much for your time and hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you, Mo.
You've been listening to Hashem's podcast with our expert today on the oil and energy crisis, and we'll definitely have him on again because this man knows what he's talking about. So we'll speak to everyone soon. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.